Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? I'm mic'd here, so my lecture is going to be formal because I want to get some ideas on the table and I don't want to screw it up. So I'm going to give you a formal lecture about what I think about this question, and then we can be more casual during the Q&A session, okay? So I'm actually going to be a professor now. Okay. So I've thought about the person of Jesus my entire life. I'm obsessed with the guy. I grew up Roman Catholic and began my adult life in a Benedictine monastic seminary. I wanted to be a monk. There I prayed a lot, studied the New Testament, the Hebrew Bible, philosophy, psychology, and prayed some more. In the monastic library and my classes, I discovered the writings of Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and modern spiritual teachers. I discovered that other religions spoke of a human divinity or an experience of ultimate reality that I had assumed was only present in Christianity. Just as importantly, I discovered that there were ways of thinking about such things that could make sense to a modern person like myself. I found this all incredibly liberating. So I graduated from the seminary and worked for 8 years on a PhD in an area called the history of religions, which you are free to translate as comparative religion. My specialty was, and still is, something called comparative mystical literature. That is, texts from around the world that express some secret unity, even identity, between the human being and some transcendent dimension of existence. Sometimes a god, sometimes not. Mystical is a Greek word or a Greek adjective that means simply secret, and it is commonly used to refer to this secret unity or hidden divine nature. I know as a scholar of mystical literature that countless human beings have experienced themselves as divine, as secret gods throughout human history. I also know that they continue to have these sorts of experiences to this very day. Jesus, as best we can gather from the texts that gathered around his memory, was one such individual. He is by no means alone, though, in experiencing the divine at the deepest core of the human. So how do I see him? I see the historical Jesus as a radical social prophet and Jewish mystic. That is, as a human being who experienced himself as united to God, perhaps even as identical to God, who because of this union with God, aligned himself with the poor, the suffering, and the socially marginalized, who rejected the religious purity codes of his day, hence all those prostitutes and tax collectors of the Gospels, and who was finally executed for his highly subversive stances against the political and religious authorities. The much later doctrines and beliefs that developed around his memory were highly contentious and did not really settle down until the 4th century, almost 400 years after he had been executed. Many streams of influence went into this institutionalization, but some of the most significant were the visionary experiences of another Jewish mystic, the rabbi named Saul or Paul. Paul never met the historical Jesus, but experienced what he interpreted to be the resurrected Christ in a mystical vision and out-of-body experience of ascent into the heavens, which is how they thought of the universe at that time, as a series of spheres. The early texts, most of which never made it into the New Testament, give witness in very different ways to both Jesus' radical social message and his revelation of human divinity. The voices and traditions that won the cultural wars of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, and so became the New Testament and eventually Christian doctrine, restrict the experience of human divinity to a single historical person, that is, to Jesus. In actual historical fact, however, this experience of the human as divine is a common, if always culturally shaped, event in the history of religions. That is my main point, which I have already repeated and which I would like to expand on now. Put most simply, I am suggesting that being a god, or the Son of God, or an avatar, as we have it in many Hindu traditions, or being a Buddha, as we have it in many Buddhist traditions, are all nothing more and nothing less than mythical ways of expressing the stunning truths of mystical experience. I am also suggesting that such mystical states may be relatively rare, but they are by no means restricted to any culture, community, or religion. Quite the contrary, they appear to be universal human potentials that can be actualized in very different ways through the languages, cultures, and mentalities of the place and time. Let me flesh this idea out with a few concrete examples. I have just 3, and then a 4th. Meister Eckhart, Meister's German for master, so let's call him Master. Master Eckhart was a professor and priest whose popular teachings were condemned by the church shortly after he died in the year 1328. Here are a few of the Master's zingers. So this is Eckhart. The knower and the known are one. Simple people imagine that they should see God as if he stood there and they here. That is not so. God and I, we are one in knowledge. All things are to God as a drop in the ocean. The soul imbibing God turns into God as the drop becomes the ocean. Everything that Holy Scripture says of Christ is entirely true of every good and holy man. The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. Okay, so example 2 is a friend of mine named Bill. Bill once experienced the immortal, divine, timeless Atman, or self, capital S now, of which the Hindu tradition speaks. Bill knew this cosmic being at the core of the human being when a spiritual teacher named Swami Muktananda touched him with a peacock feather. The touch literally shocked Bill into his own divinity. He describes it as an electric-like physical event. Here is how he describes the experience which took place in Florida in the early 1970s. It felt like an awakening, like an ecstatic recognition that I was this dynamic, expansive, swirling mass of joyous consciousness, that I always had been that, and that I always would be. There was a deep, solid inner knowing that this was who I was, that this was very real, that it was much more real than my previous sense of myself as a limited, suffering, ignorant ego with a body. In fact, at one point during this experience, I remember laughing, realizing on some level of my being that my previous identification with my body and my ego was a cosmic joke. Knowing that I never was just an ego and I never would be just an ego, recognizing in the core of my being that contrary to what I'd always believed, I never had suffered and I never would. That single cosmic experience changed Bill forever. His response? He became a professor of religious studies at SMU, just up the road. Third example is the Harvard neuroanatomist Jill Bolte Taylor and what she calls her stroke of insight. It occurred on December 10th, 1996. Taylor, on that morning, had a massive brain stroke, which completely shut down the left hemisphere of her brain, where, by the way, the software program of the ego is, where language, math, and linear thought also generally reside. The result? She entered a mystical state of immortality and infinity that she now experienced as streaming through her right hemisphere, which had been more or less silenced by the chattiness and superficiality of the left brain and the rational ego. So she talks about this as this cosmic consciousness is normally shut out by the left rational social ego of the other side. By the end of that morning, she writes, my consciousness shifted into a perception that I was at one with the universe. She was, quote, comforted by an expanding sense of grace. She soared into an all-knowingness. She now knew the brain body as, quote, a portal through which the energy of who I am can be beamed into a three-dimensional external space. The body now revealed itself as, quote, a marvelous temporary home. She marveled at how she could have spent so many years unaware of this, never really understanding, quote, that I was just visiting there. In short, the ego on the left side of the brain was revealed for what it in fact is, a social construction, a fiction, a piece of software. And consciousness was revealed for what it truly is, a presence of mythological proportions that is filtered through the brain and body, but is in fact neither. Jill Bolte Taylor chose a single word to describe this state beyond space and time. She chose the word nirvana. So there is a Christian, a Hindu, and a Buddhist example of what I am trying to say this evening. Perhaps you need something from the Bible to hear me. Here then is a passage from the Gospel of Luke, which a monk friend sent to me after I sent him this lecture last night. I relay it to you exactly as Brother Gregory sent it to me. The disciple is not above his master, but everyone that is perfect shall be as his master. That's Luke 6:40. There is another way of saying all of this. Take the subject of miracle, about which I have written a good bit in my latest work on the paranormal in American culture. As with the experiences of human divinity, miracles, exorcisms, possessions, healings, and even resurrection accounts are by no means restricted to early Christianity. The Christian scholar Craig Keener recently published a marvelous 2-volume study on what he calls the credibility of the New Testament miracles. To establish this credibility, Keener documents and discusses in some 1,200 pages various miracle cures and paranormal phenomena from Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and the modern West. What he really established by doing all of this comparative work, of course, is that what people call miracles are distributed across the globe. They appear in every human culture and are in no way restricted to any particular religion, place, or time. As a most provocative example, I have a fourth and final story from you. This one taken from, of all places, CNN. This appeared on CNN last fall on September 23rd. I'm just going to read you a portion of the piece. Nina DeSanto was about to close her New Jersey hair salon one winter's night when she saw him standing outside the shop's glass front door. It was Michael. He was a soft-spoken customer who'd been going through a brutal patch in his life. His wife had divorced him after having an affair with his stepbrother, and he had lost custody of his boy and girl in the ensuing battle. He was emotionally shattered, but DeSanto had tried to help. She'd listened to his problems, given him pep talks, taken him out for drinks. When DeSanto opened the door that Saturday night, Michael was smiling. "Nina, I can't stay long," he said, pausing in the doorway. "I just wanted to stop by and say thank you for everything." They chatted a bit more before Michael left and DeSanto went home. Excuse me. On Sunday, she received a strange call from a salon employee. Michael's body had been found the previous morning, at least 9 hours before she talked to him at her shop. He had committed suicide. If Michael was dead, who or what did she talk to that night? It was very bizarre, she said, of the 2001 encounter. I went through a period of disbelief. How can you tell someone that you saw this man, solid as ever, walk in and talk to you, but he's dead? Interacting physically with a living dead man, of course, is exactly what the New Testament accounts report about the resurrection appearances of Jesus. So what am I really saying here? I am not saying that these things could not have happened 2,000 years ago around a Jewish rabbi brutally executed by the Roman state. I am simply observing that these things did happen 11 years ago in New Jersey around a man who had just committed suicide. If we add to Nina and Michael the elaborate witness of the entire history of religions, which contains countless cases, the conclusion, it seems to me, is irresistible. We, all of us, are much stranger than we believe at this particular cultural moment. We are not who we think we are. We are not our surface egos. We are not our left brains. We are not even our religious identities, which, if the truth be told, are simply different kinds of socially constructed egos. And we certainly are not our beliefs. We are something or someone much, much greater and, frankly, infinitely more interesting. In light of this, it seems to me that we can reasonably affirm the general tenor and witness of the New Testament without restricting those historical experiences of miracle, healing, human divinity, and even immortality to one culture, one religious tradition, much less one person. The New Testament writers did not know what we know now. There was no comparative study of religion, no sociology, no anthropology, no neuroscience, no university. Most of all, they lacked a democratic social base to think and articulate such things clearly, safely, and freely. They thought in terms of kings, kingdoms, monarchies, and radical social hierarchies, not open democracies, civil freedoms, human rights, and a global humanity. But we can think and say these things clearly, freely, and safely now. Thank you for inviting me to do just that.
Thank you. I've also thought about Jesus my whole life, but my study and experience have taken me in a somewhat different direction. I want to begin by talking about the question we are trying to answer. How we answer the question, who we understand Jesus to be, depends greatly on how we frame it. If we ask, who was Jesus, we are likely to get one set of answers. If we ask the question, as I will, who is Jesus, we are likely to get another. The present tense is indicates that we want to talk of Jesus in the present, not just about the Jesus who once lived, taught, did certain things, was brutally killed, and so on, but also about the Jesus who is. In what I would call traditional Christian thought, in which I place myself, the present tense verb is taken simply to mean that Jesus is alive. God raised him from the dead, and therefore he is not dead, he lives. Therefore, if this is true, understanding Jesus, knowing Jesus, cannot be confined to understanding him only in his past. He will not be known solely by the means of historical study. He is also known by faith and love, indeed through experience, through and in the practices of prayer and fellowship, the celebration of what we call the Lord's Supper, communal and private worship, through the scriptures that bear witness to him, and indeed beyond the confines of the church and the scriptures as well. They are also, all of these are a source for knowing Jesus. There are many ways that the real Jesus, the living Jesus, is known, and many sources by which he is known and known in the present. 2 further points about knowing Jesus. First, to know Jesus or to know anything about Jesus means that we have to say something about what happened after his death, after his crucifixion. Without some kind of afterlife of Jesus, as it were, we would almost certainly have no information of any kind. Now, we may disagree on what that something is, whether it is, as I think, the resurrection, or whether it is the emergence of the Christian church, the early Christian church. But something happens after Jesus' death so that today we have knowledge of him. And this leads me to my second point about knowing Jesus. Our only real access to the historical figure of Jesus is through the memories of his earliest followers. And these, I believe, are found first and foremost in the documents that now comprise the New Testament. While there are very brief notices in both Jewish and Roman sources about him, on their own, these sources really tell us little about Jesus. What they show us is that these sources were interested in Jesus primarily because of his followers and not because of him. So without the New Testament, for all its confessional particularity, we would know virtually nothing about Jesus. Therefore, to know Jesus at all is to accept a community's witness, this community's witness to, and memories of him. In my view, there's simply no way to circumvent that. Some of the letters in the New Testament are the earliest Christian literature that we have. The 4 Gospels in the New Testament are not only the most complete accounts of things that Jesus said and did, but also the earliest complete accounts. They contain extensive traditions about what Jesus taught and did, and in spite of their differences, and there are differences among them, the Gospels bear witness to a single recognizable figure we know as Jesus of Nazareth. They cohere. In a sense, the very existence of multiple Gospels suggests that Jesus is greater than their sum. Although in many ways the so-called quest of the historical Jesus seems determined to find an uninterpreted Jesus who is less than any one gospel, in fact, he is, I believe, in Christian confession, more than the sum of them all. While, to be sure, the New Testament witnesses have interpreted the mission and person of Jesus in light of his death and resurrection, the Gospels are bound by traditions received about him. It is the stability of these traditions that make historical study of Jesus possible and I believe, bear witness to what I'm about to say in order to answer further the question, who then is Jesus? Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew. He was very much part of the Judaism of his day. His earliest followers acknowledged him as the Messiah of Israel. And Jesus speaks in the Gospels of his mission as being to and for his people. The Gospels witness that Jesus was crucified as King of the Jews. That is, his teaching and actions led to this charge against him. Jesus would not have been hailed as King or Messiah, if you will, after his death, as he was in earliest Christianity, if he had not been thought of as a king before his crucifixion. There is nothing in the early Christian confession that he is raised from the dead, nothing in the resurrection, that changes a non-messianic or non-kingly figure to a royal or messianic one. Rather, the resurrection is the vindication of what he was and who he was. There is therefore a line, if not always a perfectly straight line, from Jesus' life and mission to the cross to the early church's confession about him. According to the Gospels, Jesus proclaimed the kingdom of God, the rule of God, in contrast to the rule of Rome or of any Jewish king. As proclaimed by Jesus, the kingdom embodied God's purposes for justice, peace, healing, and wholeness. In a nutshell, what we call salvation. Because Jesus taught the will of God, called people to repent, warned people about the consequences of failing to heed his words, and performed mighty deeds of healing and exorcism, he was thought of in his time as a prophet. That is, as one who speaks and acts on behalf of God. And it is precisely this identity and this claim that he speaks on behalf of God that occasioned no little controversy in the first century. Both as king and prophet, Jesus himself claimed to act in and by the power of God, rather than by his own innate power, for the tasks that had been given him to accomplish. He exercised, therefore, a vocation, a messianic vocation, which he believed was given him by God. That vocation, as I have already hinted, was aimed first and foremost at the people of Israel. Therefore, he called 12 disciples who represented the 12 tribes, warned that Israel would be divided and divided precisely over their response to him, drew on commands of the Torah to make love of God and love of neighbor central to Israel's identity and life, and indeed announced a vision for Israel's corporate life that would not privilege power and prestige, but lift up the lowly and bring together righteous and sinner at table fellowship. All this anticipated the coming kingdom of God. This schema fits very broadly under the rubric that is today known in New Testament scholarship as Jewish restoration eschatology. That is to say, the expectation that God would act to reclaim his people for their salvation and wholeness. Jesus' mission was focused on the gathering together of this people, with himself at its heart and center. The Gospels present Jesus' own death as integral to this work. To put it differently, Jesus died for the same things that he lived for: the calling together of God's people, the renewal of God's covenant with them, the forgiveness of their sins, so that they might be a city on a hill, a light to the world, in anticipation of God's final salvation for all peoples and all the world. The Gospels show Jesus as expecting his own death. How could he not? To be hailed as Messiah, to speak of a coming kingdom, to promise justice, to stand against the orders of the day were part of Jesus' vocation. And the faithful exercise of that vocation would inevitably lead to some power moving or acting against him. In this case, it was Rome, the government then who oversaw the province in which Jesus found himself crucified. However, if Jesus had simply predicted his own death, then he also predicted the ultimate failure of his mission. Instead, the Gospels show him as anticipating his vindication. He drew on the scriptures, which throughout talk about the righteous who suffer and yet pray for and hope for and expect their vindication in whatever form it would come from God. Jesus surely did so as well. The Gospels present Jesus in a remarkably exalted role. He claimed to know what God was about to do, and in fact, what God was doing. He claimed to know who would be in the kingdom, and he claimed that being in the kingdom had to do with hearing his call and following the way he laid down for his people. He even claimed to be part of the final judgment and knew on what basis people would be vindicated by God, and the list goes on. In many ways, we see Jesus' most daring claims and strongest convictions coming to expression in what he promised in the name of God: eternal life, entrance into the kingdom, forgiveness of sins, and the blessings of salvation. There is a kind of paradox to Jesus' self-claim. The very terms that characterized him in his earthly ministry, prophet, Messiah, Son of God, that witness to his distinct identity and role, show that this identity was found in his relationship to God, and that his mission was carried out in service of and obedience to the God of Israel. The Gospel of John, looking back on and interpreting Jesus' ministry, depicts God as, and this comes close to the text that Jeff cited from Luke, but in John, Jesus is reported as saying that whoever receives me receives the Father who sent me. To know Jesus is to know God, to know his Father, and to participate in the union of Jesus with God that is known as eternal life. The rest of the New Testament and subsequent Christian thought follows these trajectories out. Hence, as the book of Hebrews in the New Testament puts it, Jesus is both the Son of God, whom God sets above all other beings, heavenly or spiritual, and our older brother, one who suffered and struggled as we do on the pilgrimage of this life. Paul can speak of Jesus who emptied himself, poured himself out, took the lowly form of a slave, and even died a slave's death on a cross, but was now highly exalted by God and given the name that is above every name. This both and of Jesus' identity, his fully human and historically particular life, and his unique identity in relationship to God, was finally expressed in the creedal formulations about Jesus and his relationship to God. These, what I think are organic developments, use later concepts, to be sure, to re-express the identity of Jesus. But in my view, they make the same judgments about Jesus' identity, namely this: that he is one with God in a way that distinguishes him from us, and that he is one with us human beings in a way that unites him with all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, we're going to set up here with chairs, and I'm going to invite Dr. Kripal and Dr. Thompson to come up. While we're doing that, I want to thank you so much for taking time to come and partake and participate. And I do want to emphasize participate as we move on in the program. Again, there will be an opportunity. When do they get to learn about this? We're going to read it. Okay, and it's in your thing. All right. You may either ask your question at one of the microphone stations, which will be positioned around the auditorium, or you can submit your question via text. Simply text Veritas, a space, and then your question to 41411. So it's in the bottom of your bulletin there if you'd like to do it that way. And then I will be fed some of your questions. So the way we're going to begin is to allow our two speakers, if they have questions of one another, to have a dialogue to start. So, go ahead. And one of the things I would like, just to get you started, is I heard maybe, this is what I thought I heard, a universalistic perspective versus a particularistic perspective. I could be totally wrong, but it gets you started.
So, yeah, it actually relates to the question I would have with Marianne. My perspective is not exactly universalistic or particular, but both. In other words, I think all human communities, all human cultures have experienced something that we can think of as divinity or the sacred or the transcendent, whatever word you want to use. But that is never experienced in any pure or immediate form. It's always mediated through language, through culture, through our egos, our psyches, our families, absolutely everything. And so there's a very particular quality to it, but that it sort of opens out into a universal dimension. That's what I would say. It's always a both and for me. So the question, I mean, when I was listening to Marianne, I was having a really hard time coming up with a question because I didn't have any problem with what you were saying. As long as we understand that that was the experience at that time of those people, and that those experiences were then recorded in these set of texts, which then formed other communities and other memories and other traditions. I mean, that's how the religion works. So my question has always been, okay, that's the Christian tradition, or that's the Christian traditions. But gosh, what about the rest of humanity? You know, I mean, they experienced divinity in very different and yet similar ways too. And I don't think it had anything to do with the historical Jesus. And so that's been the reigning question for me all along, is essentially the problem or the promise of religious pluralism, to put it really simply.
Sure. Well, I guess I would say my view is particular and universalist too, but in a different way, namely that it is precisely the particular that becomes universal. In other words, the particular historical figure of Jesus has universal significance. And it is this Jesus, this particular Jesus, who has that significance. So, that's probably nothing new to what you've heard. But I guess I would have two questions, Jeff, when I listen, that might help you get sort of a take on what I'm thinking or doing, and that might be a question to you as well. And the first one would simply be this: how do we have access to Jesus' experience? In that it's not something that becomes featured in the Christian tradition. In other words, Christianity does not claim that it is Jesus' experience, that counts, as it were. The Gospels, I think, hint at some things: Jesus praying, rejoicing. You could derive some of that, but in fact, it's not a salient part of the tradition. And the second point would be this: am I hearing a difference between us on this point? That you talk about the primary experience of the self as divine, or a divinity discovered within, which I would say does not characterize Jesus' experience, or at least not the experience that matters in Christian faith, because Jesus, curiously, while he calls people to himself, does so as an agent or ambassador of a God who is external to him and to all others. So that might be a difference in the way we understand divinity, namely whether that is in fact discovered within, or whether the tradition points us beyond ourselves to discover some figure, some entity outside. Is that right, the way I'm understanding or did I mishear?
No, I think that's close. I mean, I'm really coming at it. I think you're correct. The biblical texts do not give us access to the interior experience of Jesus. I'm with you on that. Yeah. But they do present a historical human being who claimed, and the tradition claimed, to have been God. I mean, that's the Christian claim. That's the claim of orthodoxy from the 4th century on, that Jesus was true God and true man.
Right.
And so what I'm interested in with all of these other religious materials and figures, including all of the contemporary people, is experiences that essentially point to the same kind of truth. Although it's no longer Jesus, it's not just Jesus. To speak really technically, the traditional Christology is my anthropology.
Right.
That's really what I'm trying to say, and we can weave that out if we care.
What does that mean?
Well, so Christology is a traditional area in Christian theology, and the question is, who is Jesus? That's the question. And the fact is, in the early churches, they disagreed profoundly on this. There were multiple models of who Jesus was, and the one that won in 325 at the Council of Nicaea, and it was this true God, true man Christology. So when I say my anthropology is your Christology, I think that all of us are true God and true man, at least potentially, that we all have access to divinity, and that it is by no means restricted to one historical human being or one tradition.
Yeah.
So let me, just one simple, so there's the story I always like to tell here is my favorite poet and artist is William Blake, the great English romantic. And there's this wonderful scene towards the end of his life where one of his friends, Crab Johnson, comes to him, and they're talking about this very question, who Jesus Christ is or was. And Blake says, Jesus Christ was true God and true man, and so am I, and so are you. And that's it.
Yeah.
That's my basic. Now, that doesn't mean that Marianne is God or Jeff is God. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that human beings have these sorts of experiences all the time that point to this dualness in us, this humanness too.
And I guess I would say, yes, the New Testament, the Christian tradition drawing out of the Jewish tradition points to experience. You cited Paul, mystical experiences of some kind, caught up to the third heaven, whatever these things might be. I don't think the New Testament, I don't think Christian tradition presents Jesus in that way. In other words, it does think of him from the beginning as his identity is distinct. Whatever we are as children of God is not what he was. And it's that other. And I guess I would take some issue, or whether it's true that there's a wide diversity of opinion about, or as wide a diversity as you might think, about that union of human divine in Jesus during the first couple centuries. It seems to me what is baptized, for lack of a better word, at Nicaea in 325 is the result of, expresses what has been thought of for a long time, rather than sort of simply silencing myriads of other voices. But I guess, when you say Blake's, Jesus is God and man, so am I, etc., that's the statement I think I cannot make in the same way that we make it of Jesus.
Right.
Yeah.
And I can.
Yeah. And that's that. And that I think is probably the major point of difference to us, right, in the way we read the text, understand what earliest Christians claimed for Jesus.
And
so.
and I'm not even attempting to be faithful to the Christian tradition.
I understand that.
That's not. That's.
I understand that.
Let me ask you a couple of questions so we can get to the audience questions too. So how would you respond to the common view that that he was a good religious teacher, but nothing more?
Go ahead.
Well, I say he was a good religious teacher. That is to say, when the early Christian church confessed that he was raised from the dead, they did not then discard the Gospels, which contained the bulk of that teaching. I would say the assessment of Jesus as a good religious teacher founders on the historical evidence. Namely, it cannot explain his crucifixion, and this has always been said. It doesn't explain how he gets crucified as King of the Jews. It cannot explain the rise of the early church. For example, John the Baptist is reported by the first century author Josephus to be something of a prophet who was hailed by the people. He was put to death, and there is no movement today. There actually is a sort of little movement here and there that follows John, but it doesn't have he doesn't gain a following like Jesus. There's something more to Jesus that explains what I called his afterlife. A second point about the great moral teacher, my fear, and this may be, again, that particular concern, that tends in some ways to cut him off, I think, from his Jewish heritage, because usually what is held up as what is great about Jesus' moral teaching tends to be what is more universally or abstracted. And in fact, if you read the Gospels, he spends a lot of time discussing with the Pharisees about hand washing, which were purity regulations that the Pharisees developed in the first century, or about tithing, mint and dill and cumin, what you can do on the Sabbath, what if you do an animal falls into a pit. All this is current in his day. And most of the discussion about Jesus as a great moral teacher runs the risk of losing his historical setting. And then I guess the final thing I would say is, yes, he teaches in the Gospels, but there's a lot of other stuff in the Gospels which people who make Jesus a great moral teacher often leave out. If you've ever seen, for example, Thomas Jefferson's New Testament with its, everything that's a miracle, or what, prophecy of judgment, or all that has to go in order to get Jesus the great moral teacher. But that's not what makes Jesus who Jesus is. So I don't think we have to deny that he was a teacher who put love of God, love of neighbor as a principle. The New Testament makes love the central thing. They get that from Jesus, I think. I just don't think it will explain historically the Christian movement, for example, or the reaction to Jesus, or that it will keep him in his historical context, which I believe to be crucial to understanding him.
Yeah, I think that's all correct. I would just urge us to not think of the sacred as the good. In other words, charismatic religious teachers have a certain power or energy or charisma to them, and it's not simply a function of moral teachings. The sacred is not the good. In fact, sometimes the sacred kills you. The sacred is the powerful, it's the energetic, it's what changes you, what transforms you. And that isn't just about being a good boy or good girl.
So let me ask a question sometimes professors don't like, which is, in your learned understandings of Jesus, does it impact your life in any way?
Oh, I think about Jesus all the time. Yeah.
Care to elaborate?
I'm not sure I should elaborate. I'll just get into trouble if I elaborate. I'll just say this. I guess I'm horrified by how Jesus is misrepresented in our political discussions. I think he stood for pretty much everything the exact opposite of what he's represented as standing for. That's all I'll say.
Okay. Dr. Thompson, do you want to say something?
Sure. Let me pick up on something that I said about my understanding of the historical Jesus, namely that I used the book of Hebrews to talk about the eventual claim that Jesus is both our older brother, that's the language of the book, as well as one who is called Son of God and seated by God at his right hand, a way of talking about the honor or exaltation given to Jesus. In my understanding of Jesus, as I read the Gospels and I see him in the New Testament, it really does matter to me that he was a fellow pilgrim, that he walked the way we walk, and that we can call him our older brother. So if you think of the gospel stories, if you know the gospel stories, he's tempted, he faces temptation, he experiences struggle in the Garden of Gethsemane, he's betrayed by friends, he agonizes in prayer, I believe he goes to his death with the conviction he will be raised, but it is the same way that we go to our deaths, with the conviction, the hope that there is more, that God will be faithful. It matters a lot to me in my own Christian life that I believe Jesus walked this way ahead of us. Not only that he is one that Christians call Lord, and you can use terms like that, who commands us to follow him, to live a certain way, but that whatever he asks of us, he was there first, living it out. And so when I think of how Jesus shapes my life, it is that sort of daring trust in God, that freedom to trust God, that can sit loose to possessions and the concerns of this world and puts one's life in the hands of God. That's what I think Jesus did. I'm not saying he's the only one who did it, but I think he did that. Yeah. And that is one of the things that most powerfully speaks to me when I think of what we call the life of discipleship, is that it's not only following someone who goes out ahead of us, follow me with a command, but with an example, a way of living that leads us to God.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to move into your questions. I have some of them here. Let me, while I'm working, we have a question for Dr. Kripal. Why is it that realizing our true nature and finding our inner divinity seems to be so difficult and rare?
That's a great question. I think this is where, the neuroanatomy helps us, the Jill Bolte-Taylor stuff. I mean, we as social beings function largely as egos, as conscious egos that are formed over years and decades. And we need those egos. We need to believe that we're separate from one another. We need to be able to walk down a hallway. We need to be able to drive. We need to make a living. We need to do all these really practical things. For millions of years, we needed to kill things and eat things. So this really hard sense of self has to develop. It has to be very, very stable for us to survive as a species. And so I think that's why these states are so rare, is because once that ego forms, once the social self has congealed, it shuts out all of this other stuff. And so to get that other stuff back online, you usually what has to happen is something very traumatic has to happen to that ego. And so you see a lot of these mystical states in near-death experiences, in car wrecks, in traumas, in dream states, anything that reduces the sense of ego. And so I think that's why they're so rare. it's hard to get anything done when you're one with God. It's true.
My question is for Professor Thompson. I noticed in your discussion you spoke of Jesus citing the Gospels and the Bible repeatedly, which I believe is a perfect way of addressing Jesus in seminary or in church. But it's a circular argument to some extent. It's the Bible is right because the Bible says it is right. So I guess what I'm asking is, do you have any historical evidence regarding Jesus outside of the Bible? Because I do not regard the Bible as history any more than I regard the Odyssey or the Iliad or the Epic of Gilgamesh as history. And I would say that I believe Josephus' account is a forgery, and I don't believe that there is any historical evidence, so thank you.
As I said, if it isn't in the Gospels, you're right. We can never know Jesus. Is my view. There is some other evidence. There are some other references to Jesus. They are few and far between. A couple of Roman historians, for example, who referred to Jesus and his followers in pretty derogatory terms. As you may know, first century Rome did not think highly of the Christians and thought that they sort of reflected about what Jesus was. There's some quote to the effect that the Christian movement, the movement started in Galilee, which is the source of all, what do you expect, bad things. So yes, there are a couple of references there. I think the reference in Josephus is embellished but historical, that Josephus does refer to Jesus. He correlates him with Pontius Pilate. There's probably, sorry?
He never says Jesus. He refers to a Christ figure or a leader.
He does name him Jesus, but it's the who is called Messiah that, notice it doesn't say who is the Messiah, but some regard him as the Messiah. The tribe of Christians to this has not died out to this day,
But there's no account of miracles or divinity.
There's no account of divinity, no. There is a statement who did, strange feats. That's debated about whether that's Josephus or not. The historical evidence of the Gospels, it seems to me, fits Jesus into a first century milieu. It explains him vis-a-vis. He looks like a first century Jew, and he can credibly give rise to the New Testament that we have. Granted, there is development of thought, so that I believe that the New Testaments can be regarded as presenting a historically credible picture of a first century would-be prophet. I understand that the quote in New Testament itself may not say that's history, but I'm just saying if this is what we've got, this is what Jesus looks like, and I believe that will fit into the historical context.
Okay, is there a question over on that side? We can go over there.
Thank you. This is a question directed for Dr. Kripal. The examples that you used in your lecture seems to be all experience-based examples. Those kind of paranormal examples or out-of-body examples were also recorded in the Bible as well. Peter was able to walk on water for a few seconds. The apostles were able to have powers to drive out demons or heal the sick and so forth. But it seems to be the Bible has a very fine line drawn between the experience and the identity. But it seems from your talk, unless I understand it incorrectly, you seem to jump from that experience directly to the divinity in human, or having the potential to achieve that divinity. So could you clarify that line, that if there's one, you can draw between the two? So to what extent can you classify something as having a divinity potential? Can an animal do that? Can plants do that? Or is it just something that human experience could achieve and could qualify for it?
So the reason I describe those as experiences of divinity is all three people describe them that way. I mean, that's exactly what Meister Eckhart says. It's exactly what Bill says. It's not exactly what Jill Bolte Taylor says. She uses Buddhist language. So language of deities and divinity is not her language, but that's not Buddhism either. So I'm simply being faithful to my sources, and I'm granting them their own integrity, and I'm believing that they're telling us the truth, essentially. And so I don't have The New Testament miracles, I suspect they're exaggerated, but I suspect they're also, there's a basis of truth there. And the reason I think that miracles probably happened in first century Palestine is because they happen every day right now. So if they can happen in New Jersey, I don't know why they can't happen in Palestine. I mean, but I'm very serious about that. I think that they've never stopped. The problem of religions have with that, the churches have always had a problem with a statement like I just made. And the reason is because if miracles don't stop and they keep going and everybody's having them, it's really hard to control people, and it's really hard to control truth and tradition. It's just too wild and crazy. But I'm suggesting that's exactly what human history is like. And that what we call God way overflows any of our attempts to canalize it into a single tradition or culture.
This is, we'll have to move on because we got people waiting in line, but this is a text that came in. It's for Dr. Thompson. What distinguishes Christianity as the one correct religion, in your opinion?
Is that a question, what's different about Christianity, or can you help me? You see what's the question after?
That's all it says. What distinguishes Christianity as the one correct religion, in your opinion?
Well, yeah, I'm not quite sure how to answer it because I'm not entirely sure what the question is asking. I think the Christian faith, growing as it does out of its Jewish heritage, believes that there is one true God and that Jesus is the one unique and full embodiment of that God. So if that's an answer to the question, what's the characteristic distinction of Christianity, that's where I would go. If it's a different question about verification, that's I think only a matter of, I'm not sure that question can be answered in terms of what verifies one tradition.
Okay, I think it means, and
Okay.
if you actually wrote a text of this, and I'm getting it wrong, I'm sorry, but why would you call yourself a Christian and not a Hindu or a Buddhist? So, in other words, there must be something.
Yeah. You know, for me, it's Jesus. It all comes back to him. Obviously, I was born into this, and I've never had reason to leave it, although I have not always been without doubts or questions. I doubt there's a person who doesn't at some point wonder about all the kinds of things we're talking about and confessing. As I did say earlier, I think at the end of the day, we come to faith. The way that people have come to faith is not simply because they've become convinced something is true or so on, but there is a way they've connected to a community that has borne witness to this tradition. We could not be here had there not been a Christian church, or you call it what you will, Christianity. And I think now as I think about it, what I would describe the process by which I come to faith and stay in the faith is I am committed to this group of people who is committed to following this God and this person. I'm a Christian because because in it I experience, to use Jeff's term, what I believe to be healing and wholeness and great joy. And I recognize as well that the Christian church is not a tradition without blemish and sad blemishes on its history. So I would start to answer the question something like that. And then we could talk some more.
This question is for Dr. Kripal. Kind of one of the major things about Christianity is there's sort of a duality between the fact that Christ was not only significant in this life as far as bringing kind of a salvation within this life, but that there's also the hope of salvation after death. How does that tie into your sort of idea of if there's divinity within all of us and accessing that is sort of the purpose of religion? Is there sort of a continuation of that after death, or is that just something within this life and then that's kind of just the end of the story?
Yeah. So in all three of the cases I gave of Eckhart, the sort of Bill's Hindu experience and Jill Bolte Taylor's Nirvana, all of them, if they don't actually claim it, they strongly imply that their experience is what it will be like after death. In other words, once you locate your identity outside of space and time, then the body's demise is sort of a small thing because you're no longer identified with it. So yeah, those were all forms of immortality that were being described there. So these are different religious models, though. This isn't a religious model in which you rely on a deity to save you and then you die and you're judged up or down. This is not the model that I'm presenting at all, because that's not what my case studies say at all. The Christian sort of atonement model comes out of a whole long history of Jewish animal sacrifice and purity codes and all kinds of things, and that's simply not where these people are coming from. But it's a model of salvation for sure, if you want to use that word.
This question is for Professor Kripal. To me, it seems one of the big parts of the Christian tradition is that Jesus stresses his uniqueness as far as his connection to the divine.
Right.
And I'm wondering, would you consider that to be a misinterpretation on his part, or more of a misinterpretation later down the road?
Well, I don't think we know what Jesus intended, for one thing. We have memories of him. We don't have a recording. He never gave a lecture like this that they are going to put on YouTube. All we have in the New Testament comes from Christian memory 30 to 60 years after his death. So we don't know what he thought. I think Jesus was unique. But I think Meister Eckhart was unique. I think Bill was unique. I think we're all absolutely unique. Even a set of identical twins will grow up, and they're no longer identical after the first hour they're outside the womb because they're having different experiences and their brains are being wired in slightly different ways. So yes, I think Jesus was unique, but again, I think we all are. I'm still William Blake.
This is a question for Professor Thompson. Would you say that other vehicles of divinity or other religions are imbibed with false divinity, since they are not given by the Christian God?
What was it? Are imbibed?
That's what it says, imbibed with false divinity.
Imbued, maybe.
Imbued.
Huh? Yeah. I don't think there's a yes or no answer to that question. I think it's considerably more complicated for a number of reasons. I don't believe that God's presence or working is limited to the Christian tradition or to the person of Jesus. However, I do believe that there is a unique embodiment of God in the person of Jesus. And I agree with Jeff that we're all unique. You can overplay the uniqueness of Jesus in ways that I don't think are particularly helpful. But insofar as God is made known through and in his fullness in the person of Jesus, I do believe that is distinctive or unique. But that doesn't, and so I think there are a number of options. God is present elsewhere. I think there are probably false conceptions of divinity. I doubt that Jeff would deny that not everybody who claims to have an experience of the divine would we want to say that's what, at least I wouldn't want to say that's what we mean by God. If that's true, then I believe the ultimate payout of that would mean God is actually unknowable. Because if God is everything, and is simply the result of, or the product of human experience, then there is actually, I don't think, anything we could ever say that is God. And that is what I believe is the function of biblical witness, which we ultimately speak of as revelation, some way of saying this, name this God and not that God. So, and yeah, so I think there's a variety of answers to that. Delusion of the presence of God elsewhere, misconceptions, a number of ways to answer that question. And I don't think I can answer it in the abstract.
Okay.
I'd like to pose a similar question for Dr. Kripal, actually involving something about this distinction. it seems to me the whole business of mystical experience can get quite messy when you start mentioning things that we haven't mentioned, such as hallucinogenic drugs and all kinds of different things. And so what distinguishes, this is my first question, what distinguishes divinity in an LSD user versus Meister Eckhart and your friend Bill? And how do we know which of those is truly accessing the divine? There seems to be an epistemological issue. And the second question is, isn't there a basic fallacy of equivocation going on when you make these kinds of claims? When different religious traditions make different claims to the divine, but they don't mean the same thing by the divine. So how can you then tie it all up kind of into one big piece?
Yeah, no, those are good questions. Let me treat the second one first, and we can get to the drug question. I'm not saying that all these experiences are identical. Okay, so I'm not equivocating. In fact, I think all of these experiences were very different. But they were all experiences of some kind of divinity at the core of the human being. I'm not offering, I don't know what the correct model is of the relationship between humanity and divinity. I don't know that. I know, though, that human beings constantly experience these sorts of things and model it in millions of different ways. And I'm simply saying that the witness around Jesus fits into that model in its own unique historical social context. So I'm not saying that Bill or Meister Eckhart or Jill Bolte Taylor knew the same divinity that Jesus did. I'm not saying that. I suspect that Jesus' experience was very different given his Jewishness. I think he has a follow-up, Michael.
Follow up on that. Well, then how are we allowed to say that Jesus falls into the same paradigm when Jesus is making quite a different claim and seems to be drawing all kinds of different powers from these things? I mean, your friend Bill wasn't running around resurrecting dead people, Lazarus and that kind of thing. So,
well, right, but first of all, we don't have Jesus. Again, we don't have him. We have memories of what he said or did or taught. Okay? We have Bill and Jill. And we can, I think, legitimately use their experiences to make educated guesses about what the resurrection appearances were 2,000 years ago. I'm assuming that we all share the same humanity, and that what was possible then is possible now, and vice versa. Now, you may not, that may be an assumption you don't want to make, but that's my assumption. Now, let's get to the drugs. I actually do think that people can have genuine religious experiences on drugs. There's a huge literature on that. The evidence is very strong. And I think it works through the same way a car accident works or a trauma. I mean, drugs do very violent things to brain chemistry, and they can shut the ego down just as easily as a heart attack or a car accident. And so sometimes people have truly life-transforming religious experiences on some kind of drug. Most of the times they don't. You can have horrible experiences. But my position is that the moral context of the trauma is not connected to the religious state. In other words, you can have an experience of God in a car accident as easily as you can have one praying or in a religious ritual. Probably more easy. It's probably more easy in a car accident. So I don't see it as a causal thing. This is what I'm trying to say. I don't see the drugs causing a religious experience. I see the drugs doing something to the brain that traumatizes it, that then allows the human being to sort of have a grander experience of who we really are.
So just to be clear, Dr. Kripal is neither advocating using drugs nor getting in car accidents.
No, I am not.
We have time for 2 more questions, and I know we have more people, so there will be time if you want to individually ask questions, but 2 more for the general public. So we'll go here, and then we'll come back here.
My question's for Dr. Kripal as well. I know you alluded to in your presentation, you mentioned some examples of people that have had similar experiences to the disciples seeing Jesus post crucifixion.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is, as you read Paul's letters, one being to the church in Corinth, he writes that Jesus appeared first to his disciples and then to over 500. And my question, I guess, is have you, in your research, have you found other examples where multiple people saw a similar vision or a hallucination, whatever you want to call it? Because in your examples, the ones that you gave, they were more singular and kind of isolated.
Right, and the answer is yes. We have lots of cases of large crowds seeing the same thing. The most famous, actually, is 1917 or 1913, I always get it wrong, in Fatima, Portugal. After 6 months of the Blessed Virgin Mary appearing to these 3 small children, she appeared on the 13th of every month for 6 months. This is October 7th. This is 1917 now. And on the 6th month, 50,000 people were in that valley. And the sun started to spin, or that's what they saw. And then it kind of descended. And 50,000 people, not all of them saw the same thing, not everybody saw something, but tens of thousands of people witnessed something very, very bizarre there. But what's so interesting about that case is lots of people saw very different things, which again confirms what I'm trying to say here, that I think human beings are encountering something real, but it gets filtered into our psyches and into our societies in very different ways, even when they're all in the same valley at the same time. But yes, we have lots of cases of crowd visions. Yeah.
My question is mainly for Dr. Kripal, because what he said inspired this question, but I would also like to hear Dr. Thompson's opinions. If every person has the potential to reach this, like a divine or mystical experience, that we all share the same humanity, then what would you say is the value of having so many different religious traditions?
Yeah. The value, well, first of all, you know, my mom still always preaches the virtues of religion to me, about how it makes you a better person and you meet the right people, and you know, and it creates community, and isn't it a great thing that we all go to church? And that's what we call a functionalist approach in the study of religion. In other words, you define religion by what it does. And religion does a lot of good things for people. I've never been a functionalist. I've always been a substantivist, as they're called. In other words, I want to know if it's true or not. I really am asking the truth questions. And so mom never made me happy. And I never made mom quite happy on this issue. So this relates to your question. I think there are so many religions because there are so many communities and contexts and cultures and languages and physical environments and challenges and time periods. Remember, it's not as if there's one Christianity. I mean, this needs to be said. There are thousands and thousands of Christianities, and there have probably been hundreds of thousands of them through the last 2 millennia. Religion changes constantly. It changes for every community and every generation. It has to. It meets certain basic human needs. The problem I have with religion is it also creates a lot of social division. And as the planet gets smaller and smaller and the globe gets tighter and tighter, we see religion doing a lot of really nasty things. And that worries me a great deal. And so I think we need more sophisticated ways of being religious, belonging to religious communities, but not understanding those beliefs or those communities as the only way or the correct way. I think we simply have to do that, or we're in deep, deep trouble.
Okay, so I want to give the presenters, if you have a last word you'd like to leave the audience with, please do right
I've said way too much. I'll just pass to Marianne.
Okay.
You know, if we had time to talk further, I guess what I would want to talk about, Jeff, is on the whole, and I won't say entirely, when you talk about religious experience, you talk about what sounds to me like extraordinary religious experience.
That's
so
true.
that you, for example, said it's, you're as, I don't want to misquote you here, but it's as likely that you can experience, more likely you'll experience the divine in a car accident or on drugs than in sort of the
Right.
institutional forms and so on. But isn't, in fact, the most of our everyday life lived in pretty ordinary ways? So then the question becomes, what is the experience, what does religious experience look like, in just ordinary life as well? And I'm not sure that what constitutes the heart of the presentation of Jesus in the New Testament or the life of his followers is what is extraordinary so much as what is very ordinary. And then on the second point, you talk about, the world shrinking and so on. That's a reason, even if we haven't done it very well, we need some sort of discussion about public values rather than private. And so that the religious experience you tend to talk about, I realize you had some exceptions here, but tends to be deeply personal or private. And so one question we might think about it, how does the multiplication of multiple private experiences of divinity, how will that help us address what you rightly see as a real problem in this world, namely that religion divides? Is there a way, if we have a sort of way of claiming publicly, even if religion is not always the good, this is good. Everyone agrees this is bad. But that's not going to come only out of private experience. That's going to have to come out of the hard work of public discourse.
Right.
And some sort of way of measuring or assessing or valuing what is...
So what I would say to that, now see, I'm blabbing again, is that we need to form our religious egos differently. They need to be more flexible, and they need to be open to some kind of model of the human being that sees us having a shared human nature and having very distinct, unique egos and religious identities and cultural identities. And as long as we can do both at the same time, I think we'll be okay. What worries me is people confuse their religious ego or their national ego or their ethnic ego with all of humanity. And it's not. It never will be.
And are you then not eager or willing or think it's possible to talk about the moral questions of religion? In other words, for you, is what you see in Jesus and in religion and so on primarily summed up or expressed in terms of experience?
No, I see the moral. I'm the social justice issues, the healing. I'm with you on that.
Okay.
I really am.
Yeah. And that's I suppose my question about the private or the personal as opposed to how we can talk about universal good or so on.
One of the great opportunities and privileges of a college education is to explore things like this. And we really thank our presenters for taking this time out of their busy schedules, time away from their families, for really stimulating our thinking. I hope that you will take this thinking and ultimately figure out for you what it means. That's a very important part of your education. Let's take time to thank them publicly.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.